Test.
Test.
Welcome everyone to this month's Azure Security Meetup. This July we have Michael Burchell from Reece Group, who is presenting to us on Azure Sentinel Data Retention. Michael comes from a consulting background and has a wealth of knowledge in the operations and use of Sentinel. So really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. As always, if you've got questions, if you want to engage, please jump into the YouTube chat. We can leave those to be addressed at the end, or if it's really pertinent, I'll jump in and interrupt Michael. For those of you who are interested in next month's event, that will be announced on the meetup page shortly. We're going to have someone come through and talk about securing PaaS resources within inside of Azure. So, designing and building solutions in Azure to be secure from baseline. But for tonight, I'll pass it over to Michael and he can give us all he has to know on Azure security.
Cool, thank you very much and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your Wednesday night to come along, and also obviously I hope everyone's keeping well during lockdown. I know I'm kind of losing my mind a little bit this time around, so I'm hoping we'll be out sooner rather than later. Quick disclaimer as well, I have 2 dogs and 2 6-month-old children that may scream during this. I would normally shut the door, but the dogs have will just scratch and bark, so I apologise in advance if there's any loud screams. I assure you that no one is being strangled. So tonight, obviously, we want to talk a bit about Azure Sentinel, and in particular around log retention. There's one of the dogs now already. So essentially, this talk is going to focus mostly around log retention, but I am going to try, for those who haven't had much of a look at Sentinel, give a good high-level overview as well as to what it does and how it hangs together. So just quickly about myself. As James said, I've been around for about 15 years. I cut my teeth on Windows NT4 and have worked in the infrastructure space pretty much my entire working career. I moved into IT Consultancy and into security about 2 years ago now, and I sort of always never really thought I was doing much security, but I suppose the more you do of it, the more you learn that there is actually, a lot of crossover in infrastructure and security. But doing security well is certainly its own thing, and I think have a new appreciation for things like patching and logging in particular, and some of the other things that we do in security land. So I certainly am pretty passionate about technology and love sort of keeping up to date with it, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to work with Azure Sentinel. Now the question is, what are you guys going to get out of this? Well, for those who don't know what Sentinel is or does, I hope that you'll get a good high-level overview of Azure Sentinel. For everyone else, I think covering off, I think, some of the journey and learnings about logging and how, I suppose, from trials and tribulations of trying to manage logs really well over a long period of time, and the shifts in technology. I'm hoping that everyone will get a little bit out of that conversation at least. And whilst you may not use Sentinel, get at least a bit of a sense at what's possible. This solution that's been cobbled together out of a whole lot of different pieces of a puzzle, I think represents a strong solution, and I think that it could be applied to many other platforms. So that is, I suppose, where we're heading. So let's get into it. So let's talk about, I suppose, what is the problem with logs. Initially, there's lots of them. I think everyone who works in technology would most definitely agree that logging and the size of logs have just exploded in the last probably 3 to 5 years. cloud and SaaS platforms, you've got audit logs, you've got event logs from servers when people are logging on, or different identity platforms. So, the problem hasn't gone away with technology, and it certainly hasn't gotten any easier. So I just think, from the scale and the velocity and the size of them, there's just so many of them that you need a solution that's scalable. Logs are expensive to keep, so from the point of view of if you want to keep your logs for any particular period of time in your in your SIEM platform, that's expensive. It's not something that you really want to be doing, but you don't want to lose the fidelity either of your logs in terms of being able to, go back and look at events that have happened over 30, 60, 90 days, or however long you keep them for. But, you can't exponentially keep growing your SIEM platform either. And in particular, I suppose traditional SIEM platforms, be it, on-prem or, something that's more of a VM related solution, disk is expensive, especially the disk you need to actually read and parse and handle those logs. And ultimately, the problem with logs at the end of the day is you actually need them. I think that people, especially working in security, so infrastructure, probably gets it, but not to the point that security people are neurotic about keeping their logs. At the end of the day, if you have a compromise that occurred, and I immediately springs to mind is the SolarWinds breach. You need your logs, and you need to be able to go back to those logs and have absolute surety that you can say something did or didn't happen. And I think at the very least, I think organisations or technology people are thinking now that 12 months is the absolute minimum now that you have your logs for. And you think about, that's firewall logs, that's auth logs, that's everything. So it's no longer a proposition where you go, well, I'll just keep expanding my SIEM storage or my SIEM licensing. It's now a situation where, you need them somewhere else. So let's talk about them, logs, and, I suppose like actual logs. There's, lots of them, and they're heavy and they're really hard to handle. So logging architecture, and I will give credit to LinkedIn. There's a link down the bottom there if you want to have a look at this page. But in terms of Azure Sentinel, it's a logging platform, and it essentially takes logs from all of your different platforms, be it Windows, Azure, could be other clouds like AWS or Google, from your on-prem devices. So think firewalls, think Linux machines, appliances, and effectively you can ingest all those logs like you would in a normal SIEM into a what Microsoft call their Log Analytics platform. So effectively, that platform allows you to ingest, data in whatever sort of raw JSON, Ceph, syslog format you desire. From there, Azure Sentinel plugs in, and it effectively does the security analytics against the Log Analytics platform. So it just allows you to pull in data from different sources. You can do things like run with dashboards. You can do threat hunt queries. You can do analysis, AI, ML. And one of the big differences, I think, with Sentinel that isn't necessarily sort of jump out at you is effectively the way that Microsoft have architected it is you can dump your logs into Log Analytics, and it will basically accept pretty much any form of log. So effectively what it does is, if you take like a flat JSON file, you can drop that in and it will automatically work out the table names for you and whatnot. You might drop in it might be just a single string. So you might go, well, it's a traditional syslog where I just have a timestamp and I have a message, and the message might contain different delimiters, different components. You're able to actually, parse that in line. So you can actually parse that at query time, which means that you don't have the normal constraints of where you're trying to, look at, you know, a traditional scene and you go, well, I need to parse this on the way in, it won't accept it, I need to have my field names right, I can't change my field names because everything's all pre-written. So I think that's a pretty important distinction to make, and it's one of the reasons that I suppose sometimes people kind of shy away from it a little bit because of that sort of parsing at query time. But I think that's a massive plus for the platform. So that's Azure Sentinel in a box. So now we'll look at, I suppose, what you actually need to have a successful long-term log retention solution. So I think the number one thing is that your logs need to be available. You know, it's no longer acceptable that you know, you may have offline storage. You might, I mean, you know, I remember when logs used to be carved off to USBs or even tapes, and you know, you'd be on a wing and a prayer if you could actually come back and actually recover those when you needed them. Now, arguably, you didn't have the same pressure to identify, you know, issues sort of as we do in this cyber security space we live in now. But yeah, I think, you know, number one thing is they have to be available. Number two is obviously cost-effective solutions and scalable solutions. So again, it's not like you can go out and buy a couple of 2 terabyte disks, chuck them in a server, and you know, dump them in there until you run out of space, and then start purging. You know, that's not effective from a management perspective. It's not managed, you know, from a scalability perspective. So obviously the cloud has afforded an ability to do that now, and that's where a lot of people are going. But I suppose then the question becomes there is then how do you query these logs? So it's one thing to have them available. It's another thing to have them somewhere where you can, you know, where it's cost effective and scalable. So I think a big use case that a lot of people do at the moment is they dump all their logs into S3 in AWS or a blob if they're in Azure. But you need to actually be able to query those logs when you need them, because essentially what will happen is, you know, you'll get into a situation where you need to go and have a look at these logs at a particular point in time, and you know, you don't have a pattern to be able to query those logs and actually get what you need out of them. Or the files have weird names and you don't know which file you actually need to look at. Or you might be looking for something that you don't even know what the time or date it occurred on. So, you know, from that perspective, being able to query that data is, you know, and I made up the word queryable, but I think, you know, it's a super important component, which is, I suppose, a little bit why, you know, we gravitated towards Sentinel, because some of these issues it helped us solve. So, you know, from that perspective, and I'll open the floor if there's any questions up to this point, James. But you know, effectively, I wanted to just demo what we've implemented to give us those components, and I suppose allow us to have a fairly you know, robust solution that we're able to manage. Cool. All right. Awesome. So in terms of demos, we're going to talk about getting the logs from the platform into, you know, sort of long-term storage. We're going to talk about querying those logs on the fly. We're going to look at re-ingestion of these logs if we need to do anything sort of a bit more complicated. And we're also going to look at transitioning storage here. So I'll step through each use case and, you know, how the solution hangs together. So we'll start with getting logs from platform to storage. So I'll preface this one with a lot of this stuff is actually available online, as in, you know, quite a lot of things, you know, we've pulled out of, and if you're using Sentinel, you know, please make sure you have a look at the GitHub, the Azure Sentinel GitHub branches, because basically in here you'll find lots of things, you know, queries, parsers, dashboards, you know, basically everything that you would want to be able to put together an entire solution. So, you know, definitely the place to be. So we picked up moving the data solution from this Microsoft post. It's not the only way to do it. You can do it with things like the ADX solution, but yeah, we found this was definitely, for us, the most robust solution that we could actually implement. So effectively what happens is when the data goes into Azure Sentinel, then this is how the workspace looks. Effectively, you get all of your data sources and they come in into log tables. And the data, when it's passed in, generally will give you a bunch of JSON fields. So you effectively, get a field name, and then you also get the data compared to each key. So using Logic Apps, which is Microsoft's, I suppose, equivalent AWS kind of step apps, which is kind of like a workflow, you can actually come in and you can build out a workflow that'll actually export that data. So you get 90 days on platform, and then from there you can effectively, either choose to pay extra, which is, extortionate, or you can, store that data somewhere else. So effectively what this workflow does is it'll initialize a bunch of variables, which you can set around, your hours, the start date, which is effectively from the checkpoint that the workflow writes out, and the end date. You can also pick if you want to exclude any particular data sources that you don't want to keep. So it might be things like, excluding perf data, updates from the clients. And then what will happen is it basically runs a query against your tables and pulls out all of the different table names you've got, and between the times and dates that from the last checkpoint to the current date. From here, what it'll do is it'll then basically pick out, from the previous results. It'll then pass the JSON, and it gives you effectively all the table names that you need and the times and dates. And then for each of those, it will then go out and it will actually query the tables and run a query that effectively spits out the results of basically what's held in that table for that 24-hour period. We've got it set to export out in hour chunks. So for each day, you effectively get files for each hour, as you can see here. And these are just flat JSON files. So, if we actually go in and open one of these guys up, you'll see that effectively it's a JSON file where each log file is effectively it has each header type contained in the file. So not really super human readable, but we can fix that pretty easily in the next step. So that job just runs every day, and it drops out into Blob Storage. So it runs depending on the amount of data that's been collected for that day. And then in our long-term backup store, we then have a folder for each of our data sources, and contained within that then would be effectively all of our logs, essentially, by day and by hour. So then you go, okay, well, what's the use case? We need a pattern to bring that data back in. So what's really important here is that we've actually got what's known as the external data query here. And what this lets us do is we can actually tell it that, we've got a data type, a JSON file here. So we tell it where to find the JSON file in the Blob Storage. We then effectively can, tell it what the mapping is between the files and the strings. And by using this query, we can effectively query that file directly out of the Blob Storage. So we don't need to bring it back, as in we don't have to re-ingest it. We are actually able to query it directly as it sits in the storage. So by doing that, we can effectively then just go run, and I'm actually reading this data directly off of that file. So this is basically data going back to the 24th of April. And, if I was to look at, say, our, if I go back to SilenceCL, and I was to pick another file. So if I say, this guy here, I'm also able to do that as well, and I can effectively query that file directly as well. Now, obviously, with the use case of when we were talking about, we may not necessarily know where the files are or live. You can also put together multiple files into the query string. So what's that? 30th of March. Run again. So we're now looking at data from 30th of March. So effectively, what we can also do here now is we can directly query this data. So I have all of the fields that I have looked up available to me. So if I wanted to do something where, there's an AD agent here or an Okta system, I might go AD agent here where it contains AD agent. I can run whatever types of queries I want, and it uses effectively all the same patterns that we already use for our existing data source. So what it means is that effectively you don't have to go back and design or rewrite queries. You could effectively, if you wanted to, write this into any of your dashboards, and you could actually query external data on the fly in a dashboard even if you wanted to. There is obviously a data charge for pulling that through, but it's pretty minimal compared to what you would pay to ingest that data. We're talking about to store 100 gig a day of logs for a year, and pulling data queries in an average of one a month for long-term data queries. You're looking at around hundreds of dollars, not thousands. So that was certainly very attractive to us from a perspective of being able to manage our logs. But the biggest thing for us was, being able to query those logs, with the existing patterns. It really meant that we didn't have to go back and rewrite, things. There were some historical solutions that are, used in the past, and using Amazon Athena was one of them in the past. And effectively, because Athena was SQL based, you had to go back and be able to rewrite effectively your logs, your queries for your logs. So it didn't matter what platform you were using, you had to have, either commit to writing them on the fly, and if you're in the middle of an incident, that's not really great, or effectively, take the effort to basically rewrite your queries from whatever, if it's SPL or whatever in Splunk, or Sumo's query language. You effectively would have to translate that into SQL to be able to use Athena effectively in a scenario where you had to get to your logs in an incident. So effectively it means that we have great surety around the fact that we have our data stored in block blobs. It means that we know that we can pull that data, effectively as at any point in time when we need it, and it means that we know that we have the patterns to actually make use of that data. So if we need to find a particular user, a particular event, we know that we don't have to know two query languages to be able to pull that back. So that's effectively how we manage getting our data in there, and that's how we also bring the data back out of storage using the query language. But I suppose the other question becomes then is, what if you want to do something more complex? You don't want to do point-in-time queries. You might have a dev environment that you want to be able to bring data into, or a test environment. There's a lot of different ways that you could look at it and go, well, actually, I need to consume that data a bit more structured. So in order to do that, we kind of went back to the drawing board a little bit, and we said, well, there's got to be a way to do it, because we've got the data, and the data's in a format that we know that the platform can deal with it. So we did a bit of digging around, and effectively what you can do using Logic Apps again is effectively writing a query which effectively queries the blob storage. So in this one, what we're doing is we're looking at this particular container. So we've set up our dev storage container, and we've got effectively this guy here. So we've got a Dev Imports folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hope the demo gods are with me tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically upload these. I've got a bunch of files that I downloaded earlier. So I'm going to upload these files directly into that blob storage. There we go. Okay, we'll let that upload. If anyone's not using it as well, this Azure Storage Explorer GUI is much easier than using some of the other solutions that they have in the web portal. So I would highly recommend it if anyone needs to work with blobs on a regular basis. So our files are up. Awesome. So essentially what we can do now is this query we have here. It's going to query the dev imports. It's run on a timer trigger, but we'll just invoke this manually. So the use case for this would be, you want to do you might have a new data source. You might have a few components that you want to test, or you want to test out a bunch of new queries. And for whatever reason, you don't want to do that in your production environment. You might need to, re-instantiate the environment if you have a case of a major failure or compromise. So I would always recommend, potentially separating out your storage or having a replication of supercritical logs into another storage account, just so that if anything dire does happen, you've got them there. And then what we do is we effectively send this data. So effectively what happens is for each file that it picks up in the blob storage, it gets the file content. And we do normally have a dynamic field here, but I didn't want to take the risk that it's not going to work tonight for the demo. So effectively I've chucked in the table name, but you can actually pull the file name out of in the dynamic content. You can actually pull the file name out and then strip it into a string, but I wasn't having a huge amount of luck with that when I was testing prior to today's event. So I'm just going to enable that job. And then under Logic App Designer here, we'll then actually just run this trigger. So what that'll do now is it'll go in and it'll check for data. Now, what I will also do is I will open up the Sentinel environment, open up the dev environment. And if we take a look at logs, this one's basically empty. And what have we got here? So it's just a usage table. So there's no actual data being held in here. So we'll let that sit there for a second. And if we go to the overview here, we'll see that we refresh this. We'll see that basically for each file there was a separate job. So effectively picked up on every file that was in there, and the job run was successful. So we can see in the blob content here, it's picked up on the file names. So that's the 2021 04 22. That'll also be the loads. Yep, so they're all the different file names. and we can see here that we got a 200 result basically back from the Log Analytics platform, which means that was all good and successful. I will now just go and disable that before I forget. So if we refresh this guy, hopefully it doesn't take might take a couple of minutes, so I might keep chatting away whilst we're doing that. So effectively, the other use case that would potentially come in and be super useful with this external data lookup as well is where obviously you pull data into the log platform. You may come across a situation where you don't want to pull all your data in. So an example of this might be maybe you only pull in alert logs from your web filtering platform. You don't necessarily need to see each individual web transaction. Or it might be your firewalls. You might only pull your alert logs out of your firewalls and you don't pull your traffic logs in. In that instance, what you can do is you can actually use the ability to drop the data straight into Blob Storage, because as long as it's a JSON file, as in it's readable and it has these strings, then you're able to do that. So what we've done, we use Logstash for our syslog collector. I might actually pull back up the architecture diagram here. So effectively at the at this level here, where we have to be able to collect the data, we're effectively running a group of Logstash collectors. Now, the reason why we use Logstash is because it has native support and a native agent for writing directly to Log Analytics and also writing to Blob Storage. So that's all available in GitHub. So what it meant is that we can effectively drop data that was received from any data source. We can parse that if we have to. Quite a lot we don't have to, but there's a handful you do. We can parse that, and then we can drop that straight into the Blob Storage without having to actually be handled by the SIEM itself. So you could then say, all right, well, I would want to ingest maybe a couple of days worth of files so I can play around with it. That's maybe a use case for what we've just run with this dev environment. And then effectively we're able to write the queries we need to for that. And then it means that we can use the external data operator then to query those and bring them back in at whatever point we want. The other consideration around Logstash, or using Logstash as well, is the fact it plays quite nice with the Microsoft agent. So Microsoft have it's called the OMS agent. So it runs on the Linux boxes and effectively talks back to the Log Analytics engine. Logstash plays quite nicely with that. So you're effectively just replaying the logs onto a local syslog port. Some of the other log solutions like syslog-ng and syslog, they don't play as nicely with it as some of the other solutions do. So let's come back and have a look-see and see if this guy has come up. Cool. So now we're seeing custom logs. That wasn't there prior. We now have these SilenceCL logs that were pulled up out of our from our import, and I can now run and query against those as I want, and they're now held in the platform for however long your retention is for. So from that perspective, it's a pretty straightforward way to just rehydrate those logs. And there's no limit effectively to how many you can pull back in. If you wanted to, you could drop an entire month's worth of files in there, and the Logic app would more than happily just bust through those files and upload them into your environment. This is probably a good example as well of a file where effectively there's all the data is held within a single thread, a single environment, so a single string, if I can talk properly. So essentially what we would do here, and I will pull out under functions here, is where is Silence. So effectively what we've done here is if you go straight to SilenceCL, you get the raw data. If you go to Silence, we've actually written a function that's held within the function menu that actually parses that data for us on the fly. So if you scroll across, you'll see that we've actually been able to pull all the data out of this message string here, and that effectively then gets chucked into different columns depending on what you want. So it means that we can then, effectively the data just comes in and drops in, and then we can then just query that. So if I do SilenceCL, and these parsers are all available, most available in the in this GitHub repository here. So if you look under parsers, there's a whole bunch for Cisco, Cylance, Juniper, pretty much all the main platforms that you're going to want. Some of them need adjusting, like they don't necessarily always work out of the box. Is probably the one thing to say. But then you can easily just go, cool, I want to see, distinct event name or event type. And you can pick any sort of field that you want, a distinct computer. Not no data in the field. Because I'm using the SilenceCL. So if we go Silence, I wonder why all the fields were missing. And then I go distinct event type. So you'll see the difference there is effectively going to the raw file. I didn't have the extra columns there, but by running the parser, I can now run queries effectively on any of those fields, and I can run whatever data operations that I desire. So essentially, that is the whole log lifecycle management, from effectively dropping the logs directly in to the blob storage, be able to pull them back out, be able to rehydrate them, and be able to query them in situ. Now, the other piece of the puzzle, I suppose, is also being able to manage these from a cost perspective. So the way that we've done that is we look at it and go, well, effectively we would want to be able to query. So basically everything is held in the platform for 90 days. You get 90 days with Azure Sentinel, basically when you buy the license. So we go, anything that's in platform, 90 days, it stays there. The query that we run, this move log analytics to storage, only runs on the 89th day. So it'll only query and pull the data out on the day prior to it being aged out from the Sentinel platform. Then once it sits in here, then we would generally leave it in here for, effectively another 3 months, which means that effectively the data is immediately accessible for, not for 6 months, for 180 days. And then once we get to that point, there's a decision, I suppose. And what we've decided is that around things like identity logs, like Okta, Azure AD, and those components, they're not big, as in they're not like massive logs. They're not like traffic logs from a firewall. So we leave them on a cool tier, and that means they're always accessible. What we do with some of the other logs, like some of the bigger ones, is we'll transition them to archive. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Azure in terms of storage, once you transition the data to archive storage, it means you pay a minimum of 180 days for storage, no matter if you keep it or delete it. But the other thing as well is that you can't actually pull that data straight back, as in it's not available for you. So there's a period of time that you have to wait for that data to be basically brought back for you by Microsoft. So just be aware that you wouldn't just drop the data directly in there and send it straight to an archive tier, unless you're of the opinion that you don't need that data. You're happy with a sort of a 1 to 2 day lead time to bring that data back to be able to query. And again, in the case of an incident, you wouldn't want to leave yourself in a situation where you needed to be able to come back and pull that data back out at a short notice. So definitely something worth considering. You can obviously move stuff between storage tiers depending on how you need to. But from our perspective, we certainly look at it and go, well, if it's not going to cost us a whole lot to keep stuff in a cool tier and it's important stuff like authentication logs, then we would leave that on a particular tier and wait to bring it back later on. So that is effectively the solution from end to end. And I think from our perspective, really make sure we can manage our logs from a long-term perspective. So thank you everyone, thank you for your time, and any questions?
I think the first thing to say is big thank you. That was awesome. I definitely learned a bit. I suppose with the transition to storage, do you have to write? Did you have to write a lot of passes, or how did you find that that external workspace? It can be difficult to work across workspaces. So how was that transition?
Look, we had quite a lot of rules and paths that we wrote as part of our migration. So effectively, if I were to look at maybe where's one of our queries, analytics queries for Okta. So effectively, we look at it pragmatically and go, all right, well, from the perspective of Okta, we might want to look for, say, like an API token event like this guy here, or multiple failed login attempts. So effectively, it means that we can take this logic from this analytics query, and like I said earlier, we could also maybe have an analytics query that runs on historical logs as well. So there's nothing stopping us running an external data query out of an analytics rule here. So if I want to, I can basically take that guy there. And where did I have that window open? I think I was in this one here. So I can then pull that across. External data run. And then I can copy and paste this guy in here, and I can basically say, what have I done here? Alternate event type is missing. So probably a good example to show you if I need to, because I've only pulled out the strings that I would normally need to query. But I can also then go, all right, well, I want event type. And hit run again. No, it's not going to like me.
You're missing the S on the event type.
Yep, thank you. And run that again, and then that will pull the data across. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to get a result on that because that's not something that runs very often, but if I go, but effectively, yeah. So it means that we can basically work both ways. We can pull the data in if we wanted to be able to run it on a regular basis. And the other thing as well is you could also, because the file name types are also a known quantity, as in they follow a regular pattern, you could even particularly turn around and say, well, I know that a 24-hour period, all I need to adjust is if I want a particular date, I can effectively have that pre-written, and then I can just make the date dynamic. And that gives us the ability then to, sort of go, all right, well, I want to query the whole of March for a particular event type or a particular, action. And, that would then effectively be nice and easy. Does that answer your question?
Most definitely does. We do have a question about VJ, and I suppose it's a little bit of a different one. Could you maybe take us through, like, where in Sentinel would you spend the vast majority of your time as an incident responder? Right, like there's obviously threat management configuration. Where do you spend the most of your time?
So look, I suppose incidents is so effectively the way that Sentinel works is it will pull across. I'm in dev there.
Maybe we stay there.
So if we come across incidents here, so effectively what happens is all of the analytics rules that we have, so at the moment we're running, I think 90 odd, effectively these detections will then go ahead and create an incident. So from here, we're then able to effectively click through, see what entities are maybe potentially affected by this. So, you know, one of the really cool things about Sentinel is the way that it effectively, when you query on the fly and you run your analytics, if you turn on the user entity behavior analytics component, which is included in the cost, but you've got to pay for the storage, as it runs those queries, it will actually start to pull out some of the components like the entities and start to build up a bit of a mapping. I'll jump across to that in a second. But effectively what you can do is a couple of things. So effectively, you know, where Sentinel's probably not the most exciting platform to work in is that you kind of still do a little bit of hard work in reading and interpreting the logs. So you don't kind of get a nice investigation window. So in this event, I can see that we've triggered a basic authentication alert, and all it tells me is that that was triggered. Now, I know because when I wrote the rule, I was kind of 2 minds about whether I wrote it for success or failures. I ended up leaving it for both. So you don't actually know whether or not that's been successful or not. So in this instance, we look at it and we go, okay, I need to have a look at the log. I can see that was a failure. So I kind of go, all right, cool, no dramas, there's been no logging. But I suppose, you know, from the perspective of looking at an incident, you know, being able to look at the logs and understand what that log is telling you. They do also have a little bit of a, so if you hit full details here, they also have, so this is where we talk about things like the user entity behavior. So you can look at, say, the entities that are affected, and you can start to drill down into those. So when we look at the analytics rule itself, so if I go to analytics, and I go to Okta. So when you look at analytics rule itself, you'll see that we actually, as part of the query, we define in the rule logic the entity. So effectively down here, we can tell it that basically the display name and the name equal an account. So when it's starting to pull that data together, or the IP address is mapped to the IP address field. So then when we go across to entity behavior, you can actually start to see where you can search for particular accounts. You can see that that person's actually come up there, that IP address has come up there. So if you're looking for a particular IP address of interest, you can actually start to drop that into your UEBA and say, okay, well, I want to see everything that's had a chat to that IP address. You can also then click into the IP addresses or the user's detail itself, and it will actually try to pull out as much information as possible for you. So you'll see here, it's got things like if there's a threat intelligence match with that IP address, so whether it's a known bad threat actor, it might show you whether or not there's been IP address connections, and effectively this is pulling it all from our different data sources. So, you know, effectively our firewall logs, our Azure AD logs, our AWS logs, they all come in, and it's able to query those on the fly and actually go, all right, cool, well, what do I, you know, what's actually happening with that instance? So I would say as an incident handler or investigator or someone who's actually looking at incidents, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at the actual raw logs at these log events that you pull through here. So being really clear about what you're pulling from the log data, you know, taking what, you know, Microsoft and some of the GitHub solutions give you out of the box, and then adjusting those to make sure you've got the data that you need to be able to, I suppose, ask the right questions of the data is always important. You know, because sometimes you get, you know, queries like this one here, where you go, okay, it's telling me that someone's logging in from a new device or a new application. You know, how do I give some context to this? So we've done things here where we've actually pulled the event type. So you'll see here that rather than having a singular event type, we've actually started to pull it out of different data tables. So if we pick up that someone has a new login event from a new user agent, so that can effectively be a new application, a new physical device, a new OS, a new browser. So sometimes you got to do a bit of logic to kind of strip that stuff out. We can then actually see, all right, well, this person was doing Office activity. This one was a CloudTrail, authorization token request. This one was someone was assuming a role, and then you might turn and go, all right, well, that looks a bit weird, from a I wouldn't expect to see that. So you might actually then need to dig further and deeper into that data to be able to identify if that is actually a bad threat actor or not. Lastly, the other thing that you'll also be looking at is also the threat hunting. So threat hunting is effectively the same thing in terms of you would be pulling out queries, basically running queries against the data, but you're doing it at a point in time rather than doing it like creating an alert or event for it. So this is where you might look at something and go, well, from a let's take account lockouts, for example. You might go, I have a lot of those. I don't need an alert every time an account's locked out. But what I might want to do is every day run a query and see all of the accounts are locked out and make sure that, an account's not being locked out 15 times a day or whatnot. So that's where threat hunting comes in real handy. Again, there's a whole lot of ones out of the box, and you can also write some of your own as well. So we used to trigger alerts when people logged in via Global Protect, which is a VPN client. And when they came in basically from anywhere overseas, we wanted to know. Whereas now we just run a query on every day. We can see, the results, whether it's, up or down from the previous query we run. And then we can also look at the results of that and go, all right, well, is there anything funky in there that we wouldn't expect to see? What countries are logging in from? Is it a different IP address? Were they successful or were they not? So, effectively from there, you can turn and say, all right, I don't know about this guy here. I'm going to basically bookmark that one. And then by bookmarking it, what it means then is that we can actually create an incident from that bookmark for further investigation. We've also done, whilst I'm talking about it, a bunch of custom integration into ServiceNow for ticketing. So basically, when a incident is created and closed, we then create a ServiceNow ticket for that to sort of make sure that it comes up in our reporting for all of our team operations.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, I think that's all the questions we had for tonight. A big thank you for coming on and sharing. I know I've definitely learnt a fair bit tonight.
No worries. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your night to listen. And like I said, I hope everyone else learned a bit too.
I think it's lockdown, right? So everyone's got not much to do.
That's right. Settle in with a glass of wine and learn about logging.
Exactly. Yeah. So for those of you who are still tuned in, if you're looking to come along next month, that'll go up on the page sometime in the next 2 or 3 days. Like I said, it'll be on securing PaaS resources. We have another Sentinel talk penciled in for later in the year as well from someone at Microsoft. And then depending on how we go with lockdowns in Melbourne, we may get back in person for a hands-on session, sort of like a training day CTF type event. We're still working out the details of that one. Until next time, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you all soon. Have a good night.